Hello, I'm William Sieghart, and this is my Saga Spaces talk.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sunita Shroff and I'll be your presenter for this afternoon's Saga Spaces talk. Every one of our live talks here at Saga Spaces is specially created with you in mind. They're an opportunity for you to learn something new with practical tips and wonderful, valuable take-home advice. And they're also fully interactive. So you can ask questions and tell us how you feel with our one-tap emojis. Now, to get us all in the right frame of mind for today's talk, I have a question for you. Have you ever experienced the immense power of poetry to stir your deepest emotions? Or have you been comforted by a poetic phrase? Certainly, if you're anything like me, then the answer is a resounding yes. Well, our speaker today is the best-selling author of The Poetry Pharmacy, William Sieghart, CBE, who'll be explaining exactly why it is that poetry can touch us in such a positive way. So, William, as I just mentioned, you're a successful author, poetry champion, and the founder of National Poetry Day, and you're going to be exploring poetry's extraordinary healing ability to help tackle some of the harder situations life can throw at us. And you're also going to reveal how it can provide us with immense comfort and joy. So, William, a huge welcome to Saga Spaces. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, William, before I hand over to you, I'd love to know, when did you first realise that poetry really can improve your health and even save lives?
Well, with hindsight, I think I was about 23, and I went through an incredibly traumatic experience. I was crossing a road called the Cromwell Road in London, which, I don't know whether our viewers know it, but it's a big, big road. It's sort of 3 lanes each way. And I was standing at a red light waiting to cross it with lots of people. And the light finally went red, and the man in front of me started walking across the road, and a car jumped the lights and hit him just like that. And even though it was 40 years ago, I can still see and hear that traumatic incident as I saw this body flying in the air and hitting the tarmac. And luckily, a first aider was standing right next to me, and he pulled me along, and he felt the man's pulse, and there was no pulse. And so he started giving him the kiss of life, and I helped him with the pumping and all of that sort of stuff. And miraculously, this man's pulse started faintly to come back. And the next thing I knew, he was in an ambulance, and the police were taking our statements, and the traffic was rolling all over again. And the only evidence I had of this incredibly traumatic, in fact, the most traumatic incident in my life so far, was that I had blood on my hands. And I went to the pub, as you do, and ordered a large drink to help me process my trauma. But I'd learnt a poem very recently, just before that incident, by Philip Lin called Ambulances. And it was all about how you see an ambulance in your street and you say goodbye for the very last time to one of your next door neighbours as they're taken away and never to return. And you sense the solving emptiness that lies just under everything we do, and for a moment get it whole, so permanent and blank and true. And those words helped me process what I'd been going through. And I suppose in retrospect, that was the first time I can remember self-medicating with poetry. Years went by, I started a publishing business, and I started a big poetry prize called the Forward Prize, which is still the nation's biggest prize for poetry, some 30-something years on, and National Poetry Day. And I did my best to get poetry out of Poetry Corner, so that it's not just a little dusty back of a bookshop thing. Because a lot of people in this country, even though we embrace and love poetry, are quite inhibited by the idea of buying and reading it. And one day, a friend of mine who had been going through some deep trauma, she had lost her husband and lost her father, and I'd been sending her poems to help her get through her difficulties, was programming a literary festival in Cornwall called the Port Eliot Literary Festival. And she said to me, I'm going to set you up. Come and talk about poetry and its power and its importance in our lives. And I'm going to put you in a tent afterwards with a prescription pad that I've designed for you. And I'm going to call you the poetry pharmacist. And people can come and tell you their worries, and you can prescribe them a poem. And I thought this would be a bit of a gimmick, but what the hell, I'll do it for an hour. 5 hours later, with a very full bladder, I popped my head out from the tent and saw this enormous blackboard that had been filled with bookings for me for the next 3 days, the entire weekend. And I was mesmerized. I suddenly realized that this lovely friend of mine, Jenny Dyson, had come up with the idea that, in a way, breaks through the poetry barrier, because people are coming to talk about their own anxieties and their needs, and they're blissful when I prescribe appropriately and they get out of the chair a foot taller. And they do that, I think, because they suddenly find a complicity for how they feel, expressed rather more elegantly than they can express themselves, and they're not alone. They're not mad. And if that poem has been written hundreds of years ago, uh, well, then we've always felt like that. And so it normalizes the feelings that we're going through. About a week later, when I left Cornwall, I was phoned by the BBC, and one of the people who worked on the Radio 4 Saturday morning show had come to see me in my pharmacy in Cornwall, and she asked if I'd consider coming onto the radio, and I did. And while I was in the studio prescribing poems for various afflictions, the producer said, "My God, we've never had so many emails. Will you come back at Christmas and do it again?" So suddenly I found myself, really almost by mistake, becoming a poetry pharmacist. And then, almost by accident, I suppose, about 3 or 4 weeks after the Christmas break, I was asked by the then government if I would do a review of the public library network across the country and make some recommendations as to what should happen to them. And so I didn't really want to be a government inspector in a suit. And so I offered to give a poetry pharmacy in every library that I visited over the next 18 months. And as a result, listened to over 1,000 people's problems during that period, from library users, librarians, all kinds of people who came to talk to me. And that's really where I began to discover the extraordinary power of poetry. First of all, I was amazed to discover that people were willing to come and pour out their anxieties and worries to a complete stranger. And that was extremely humbling. And I soon learned that whenever I was conducting a pharmacy in a small room hidden in the back of a library or whatever, I needed a big box of tissues, because I heard some very troubled people, and I heard some very troubling things. But I also discovered that wherever you were in the country, and whatever your background and whatever your financial status and all those kinds of things, we all suffer the same problems. And that, to me, was a really intriguing part of my journey. And I suppose the biggest problem of the lot that we all suffer from in this country, and probably around the developed world, is loneliness. And loneliness seems to be most of all exacerbated by those little square things or rectangular things we keep in our pockets at all times and are constantly looking at. It's as though there is an illusion that although mobile phones have more platforms of communication than we've ever had with people, in some ways we're actually communicating less and less. Partly because in social media, people are almost having to put an avatar of themselves up. They're not saying, "I'm lonely, I'm miserable, I need a hug." They're saying, "Look at me and my smiles and my holidays and my friends." And they're having to sustain, an almost a schizophrenic life, because this social media persona isn't really them. And if we as adults struggle, so we flip through Instagram or whatever and feel a little bit jealous and depressed about other people and so on, imagine what it's like being 12. So I think there's an epidemic of loneliness, and that's certainly the condition which has been brought to me most of all as I travelled around the country. And I found my oldest poetry prescription of the lot, and the shortest for loneliness. And it's written by a Persian poet called Hafez. And he wrote 700 years ago, "I wish I could show you, when you're lonely or in darkness, the astonishing light of your own being." Isn't that wonderful? And I give it to people and I say to them, learn it off by heart, stick it on your mirror, start the day with it, especially if you live on your own, just to remind yourself, because your cat's not going to say that to you, and you need a little strength in the morning. And very movingly, I got an email from a lady saying to me, you probably won't remember me, but you came to see me in the mental health unit in Liverpool, and you prescribed that bit of poetry to me. And last night I came home to my flat and it had been burgled. And in that awful way that burglars behave, they'd ransacked it from top to bottom. And the only thing that hadn't moved were those 2 lines that sat on my mirror. Thank you, she said. It got me through the night. So I've had some extraordinary experiences as I've traveled around the nation, beginning to connect people's needs, people's emotions, people's anxieties with particular bits of poetry that I'm lucky enough to know. And what it's really made me realize is just as there's so much poetry in the liturgy of every faith, in a way, the canon of poetry is the secular liturgy. And particularly during lockdown, we were so busy sharing poetry all around on social media because in some ways uh, it helps us fill the spiritual void. But let me give you another example, and I'm going to read you a poem. Now, I know that people of my age and older, one of the trickiest things these days is the night. We all have shorter night's sleep and we wake up in the night. And whatever your age and whatever your stage, the awful truth is that when you wake up at 4 a.m, the sort of child in you is really comes out. And more importantly, you worry not about the child, not just about the child in you, but your own children and grandchildren. And I'm sure it'll make you all smile, but I've always had this theory that no one ever tells you before you become a parent that when you become a parent, you're condemned to worry for the rest of your life. Maybe it would just put us off and we wouldn't do it otherwise. But that 4 a.m, tumbled, dry mind needs assuaging, it needs calming. And one of my favorite poems for this is a poem by a man called Wendell Berry, who's an American poet, and it's called The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light, and for a time I rest in the grace of the world, and am free. Now, the awful truth is I live in the middle of London, and the wood drake and the heron are not next to my front door, and it's a bit far for me to go into the middle of the park in the early hours. But even just mouthing those words and those thoughts just helps me switch off that tumble dryer and lets my breathing go calmer and calmer, and I can drop off back to sleep. So these are the kinds of things that I think poetry can be really important and really useful for. And I know that in this country in particular, we are, in a way, poetry is our greatest cultural export. It's our language, the English language, the language of Shakespeare and so forth, that has gone all over the world. And I think we really do appreciate poetry, but we're a bit frightened of the P word. We like greetings cards in the UK, and we consume more greetings cards than any culture in the world. And I once met the publisher, one of the most successful publishers of greetings cards in this country, and he said, when Fred or whatever writes my greetings cards, I can sell 100,000 copies of that card because he's such a brilliant poet. And I equally think that the most popular form of music over the last 40 years has been rap music, which is filled with poetry. Poetry is all around us. In a way, our image of that fusty, dusty, back of a bookshop, slim volume elite thing, it confuses us because actually poetry is in the jingles on the radios and the adverts on the telly and so forth. Poetry is all around us, and we're a really poetic bunch. So I think poetry can really help. And of course, having listened to these thousands of people and their problems, I've seen them respond in the most extraordinary way. But I think also poetry has another power, which is important for our generation, um, and that's keeping our minds active. I did a bit of research for National Poetry Day with one of the big universities, with Nottingham University, a few years ago, on what people's sense of personal identity were. In other words, what is it that makes up you? What are the different parts of you in your memories? Obviously, your family and your experience and so on, but what in your head? What gives you your sense of self? And what was so apparent with people in their 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s were the poems they'd learnt off by heart when they were little. Because as you know, the ones you learn off by heart, they stay with you forever. But these days we're being assailed with all kinds of things that we have to do Sudoku and crosswords and all these kinds of things to keep our brains active. I do something a bit different. I learn poems, and I find them in a way a treasure trove, because as you learn a poem, if you say it to yourself every day, you will hear a different thought come from it each time that you say it. It's startling. Great art is always layered, and the intriguing thing about poetry to me is that once you've learnt it off by heart, it will reveal itself forevermore. And so why don't you try finding a nice poem that you've always liked and seeing if you can commit it to memory. I think also a lot of people say to me, they're a bit nervous about how to read poetry from a book. And I always say to them, don't read it like a piece of journalism. Don't read it even like a piece of fiction. Read it like a prayer. Say it aloud to yourself. Say it aloud. If you can't say it aloud because you're on the bus or whatever, say it aloud in your head, and then you'll hear it in a different way. Poems are filled with lyricism and musicality, and that won't come from just reading it dead on the page. You have to hear it. That's a critical side to it. Let me give you another poetry prescription. And again, I think one of the things that we as a generation have got more and more caught up with is fear of the future. It's a kind of fear of the unknown, and it's partly because our newspapers so often don't really sort of tell us what the news is, but what the news might be. And we've got into a terrible state, I think, of being fearful of something that might happen rather than has happened. And I suppose the most obvious example is that of things like, the beast from the east that you'll hear about in the newspaper, some terrible storm that's going to come, and then it turns out it's absolutely fine. But this is a poem by Sheena Pugh, who is one of my favorite poets. And it's called What If This Road? And I know it's helped an awful lot of people. And here it is for you. What if this road that has held no surprises these many years decided not to go home after all? What if it could turn left or right with no more ado than a kite tail? What if its tarry skin were like a long, supple bolt of cloth that is shaken and rolled out and takes a new shape from the contours beneath? And if it chose to lay itself down in a new way, around a blind corner, across hills you must climb without knowing what's on the other side, who would not hanker to be going at all risks? Who wants to know a story's end, or where a road will go? We like the mysteries of life, and they're very, very important to us. I suppose finally the poem I'd like to give you, which is a poem which originally came from a French poet called Apollinaire, and then was adapted by a British poet called Christopher Logue, who was actually the Private Eye poet. If you E.J. Thrib, he used to write all those poems in Private Eye through the years. And this is my poem for in a way, the lion who's lost his courage, if you remember the lion in The Wizard of Oz. So many people, so many patients come and talk to me and tell me about their lack of courage, their fear of starting a new relationship, ending a relationship, painting a painting, writing a book, doing something really significantly different in their lives. And they're very fearful that somehow or other they will fail. And this very short poem is my gift for you. And I recommend worth learning off by heart. It's called Come to the Edge. Come to the edge. We might fall. Come to the edge. It's too high. Come to the edge. And they came, and they pushed, and they flew.
William, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. It was absolutely brilliant. And thank you to our audience members for watching, but also for taking part. Now, I do hope you'll join us again soon for another Saga Spaces talk. Until then, bye-bye for now.